Welcome back to the channel, The Real History of Football Sheffield, the home of football. We are now 10 videos into this series, and so far it's clear that viewers seem to like two things. Firstly, the inquiring and slightly controversial questions like what actually is association football, who invented it, who actually invented the rules, who in reality were the first clubs, etc. And secondly, people like learning about those very earliest clubs, seeing where they played, knowing what the area now looks like today, that kind of thing. So because of that, this time we're going to multitask. I'm going to bend our unwritten cut-off year rule of 1867 in order to cover another 4 early Sheffield clubs, who all formed between 1869 and 1872. They are Parkwood Springs FC, who played at the Parkwood Springs Recreation Ground, Exchange Brewery FC, who played at Fox Street, All Saints Night School FC, who played at Hall Car Lane, and Pie Bank FC, who played also at Fox Street. I'm going to show you where these clubs played, but at the same time look at a few early London clubs and examine them to ask the question, were the early London clubs, were they actually clubs? To answer that question, we need to start by asking what actually is an association football club. But before we get into that and kick off the great debate of this video, we need to check with the map and see where we are and see where we're going to walk this time. So, Sheffield, England, we actually started on Parkwood Road and are currently crossing the old Great Central Railway, which was, during the time of our clubs in this video, the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway. We are next going up into the old Parkwood Springs area to find our first ground location. We then leave Parkwood Springs down Vale Road, go down to and up Rutland Road to the area between Pittsmoor and Burngreave to find the Fox Street ground. We then go down through Burngreave past where All Saints Night School used to be, then down Gower Street and Carlisle Street East to here. Today Carwood Road, but in the early 1870s was Hall Car Lane. It's a long walk, so don't be shocked when I speed things up a little every now and again. So, our first ground location, which we need to focus on at this point. We're in the old Parkwood Springs area of Sheffield. Parkwood Springs suffered very heavily during the bombings of the Second World War. It never really recovered and a few decades later became derelict and eventually abandoned. It was, however, a thriving community of industrial workers living in about 200 houses in the late 1860s, and from this community came Parkwood Springs FC in 1869. If you've seen the film The Full Monty, you will have seen this area before, as it was used as one of the filming locations in that film. So the first club and ground ticked off, so let's get back to the main question. What is an association football club? Football clubs are a major part of our lives. For some of us, they are an extremely important part. For many others, for millions even, they are something we engage in, if not on a daily basis, then on a fairly regular basis, even if we don't go to all the matches of our preferred club. Of course, you don't actually have to be a player to be involved in a football club. You could be a club member, a regular supporter. You could just engage in social media, or could just watch casually on the TV or the internet, or even listen to games on the radio. Involvement in a club works on different levels for different people. Some of these clubs, these organisations, are actually some of the largest businesses in the world of sport, boasting huge turnovers, millions of fans, members, and having assets worth also multi-millions, even billions in some cases. They are in some communities extremely important to the point where they become a main tourist attraction for people from all around the world. This is the webpage advertising Arsenal's stadium tour, for example. So what is a football club, and when is an association football club not an association football club? Well, I guess like most things we've learnt during these videos, it all comes down to proper organisation and the creation of legally recognised structures, that kind of thing. I did do a bit of research into what I would have to do if I wanted to set up a football club, and this is what I found out. I of course started with my favourite AI, ChatGPT. On this occasion, to its credit, it was quite helpful. When I asked it what a football club was, it went on about football clubs being organisations with management structures, affiliated to local football associations who regulate them and provide them with rules and the competitive league structure and so on. I then asked ChatGPT how I could set up a football club, and it told me I needed a business plan to outline my formal structure and funding. I needed players, coaches, managers and administrators. I also needed a ground, policies and a game to register with an FA. I then went on to the Amateur FA website to see what I would have to do as a London club to affiliate with them. As you can see, I would need to tell them some basics, but also I would have to tell them who our club secretary, chairperson and treasurer were, as well as the welfare officer if we had players under the age of 18. Finally, I had a look at some good general football sites that offered good advice to new clubs. These told me things like I would need a club name and colours, of course, and again, officials, secretaries, treasurers, etc. I'd need to affiliate with the local FA and to think about a club constitution, subscriptions, meetings, player recruitment and pitch hire, etc, etc. Again, it told me I would need to decide on a structure, whether that be an unincorporated, a limited company, a community benefit society, all very good, useful information. So clubs are organised, planned, formal, legal entities with constitutions, key personnel, employees maybe, systems, procedures, rules, subs, accounts, affiliations, open to the community to join, etc, all that kind of stuff. So if I didn't want all the hassle of forming an organisation and go through all that rigmarole of setting up bank accounts, registering things, raising money, filling in forms and forming committees, could I form a football club? Well, I could ring up my mates and say to them, let's have an unofficial kickabout game next Sunday. I've booked a pitch or a five-a-side area. We could even decide this is a good idea and do it on a regular basis. We might even form some basic rule where some of us turn up in one coloured strip and the other another. We might even get some of our antics recorded in the local newspaper, especially if we needed to raise money for charity or something similar. But would our efforts actually be an official football club? I guess by my earlier definition, the answer is no. It's a nice idea, but it's not a proper organised association football club. Back in the 1850s, businesses were organised. They did have banks back then. They had the concept of key management personnel. They did have rules about how businesses should operate. Those rules were, of course, different to the much higher regulations that we find today. But organisations still did have to have some form of formal management hierarchy, secretaries, funding, treasurers, rules, procedures and ways of doing things that were agreed and written down and formed a legal business entity. The earliest football clubs like Sheffield FC knew how to do all this. Right from its conception in 1857, Sheffield FC had a president, vice presidents, secretaries, a treasurer, a committee. It had committee members. It had club rules that formed a formal constitution. The club was open to all as long as you could pay the agreed subscription, of course. Early Sheffield football clubs did all this since most of them originated from pre-existing formal sporting organisations like cricket clubs. This means when members from those cricket clubs decided to form formal football clubs, they knew they had to produce meeting minutes, committees, treasurers, secretaries, rules, subscriptions, fees, membership lists and everything that goes with forming a formal organisation. This is of course what they did, and it's the reason why we have so much documented evidence that they formed in the first place, and we know exact dates of many key events. So the answer to the question, what is a proper organised association football club, I think I've just explained it. And I think I've also answered my question as to what is not an organised football club. So where is this all leading? Why am I raising this question? Well, there are clubs in history, if I can call them clubs for now, that do claim to have formed on certain dates in certain years. But the problem with most of these claims is twofold. Firstly, there is very little evidence to back the claims up. And secondly, what they are describing is not actually a football club, which probably is the reason why there's not much evidence in the first place. Let me give some examples. Dingley Dell FC. Some historians claim there was a football club starting in 1858 in London called Dingley Dell FC. There are few sources to back this up, but if you do your own research, you find that in 1858 Dingley Dell was not called Dingley Dell, but the George Sills 11. This reference is from Bell's Life of 1858. The reference reflects the fact that Dingley Dell were not an organised club in the way we know Sheffield FC was at the time, with members, meetings, subscriptions, rules, etc. The team was a random collection of old Cambridge University students that were collected together occasionally by George Sills. They never had their own ground and always played away. They were a private collection of enthusiastic players, best called a scratch or pick-up team. This is not what I would call a good example of an organised community club spreading the game. Nothing wrong with calling up your mates to enjoy a game, but that's all it was. They didn't emerge from an organised sporting background, but a university college, and their aim was probably to enjoy playing matches together, nothing more. So it's not a criticism, but football club they were not. This scratch team was so dependent on George Sills that when he got injured and retired in 1862, the team just stopped playing matches. Martin Westby, in his excellent A History of Sheffield Football book, does mention Dingley Dell. And he does say they are a football club and possibly the second oldest in the world. But I have to disagree with Martin, I'm afraid. Dingley Dell are not the second oldest football club, since they were not a football club. Not by the definition we are looking for, that being formed as a formal organisation, and in the template started by Sheffield FC and followed later by others right up to today. So we need to break off from the debate for a minute, since we've arrived at our second lost ground of this walk. This is actually quite an important ground, as it was home to two very early Sheffield football clubs, Exchange Brewery and Pye Bank. The ground was in the late 1800s called the Fox Street Ground. Today it's the Nottingham Cliff Recreation Ground. Firstly Exchange, they started playing here as their home ground from 1871. The club originated from Exchange Brewery, which, if you know Sheffield, was right next to the River Don at Ladies Bridge, near the centre of town. Exchange must have agreed to share the facilities because a year later in 1872, nearby Pye Bank FC, probably from Pye Bank Road in Pittsmore, started playing home games at Fox Street. Pye Bank did make their mark by reaching the final of the 1881-82 Sheffield Association Challenge Cup. The final was, of course, played at Bramall Lane against a Jack Hunter-led Healy. Healy won 5-0. If you want to know more about Jack Hunter and how he helped Blackburn Olympic become the first working class team to lift the FA Cup in 1883, then please see my fourth video in this series. Just to quickly show you where Fox Street was on the modern map, after we came down Vale Road from Parkwood Springs, we went under the railway line here, then here, we went back up Rutland Road, cut off at Woodfold here and into Pittsmore. We went around and up Nottingham Street to the recreation ground here. Pye Bank Road is just a quarter of a mile away, just here. So let's return to looking at early London football clubs that some historians do claim were actually football clubs. We're asking the question, were they actually football clubs or not? The next club that we need to look at is Forest FC. Westby does mention Forest FC of 1859 in his book that I referred to earlier. He does also claim that Forest FC were a football club. Unfortunately, I have to argue that Forest FC never existed in 1859 as an organised club. Again, they were just a random collection of ex-public school gentlemen who wanted to play unorganised matches against themselves. Nothing wrong with that. They played on a ground called Forest Place, which is part of Epping Forest, hence the name Forest FC. And again, this wasn't an organised club with members, subscriptions, records, etc. We only know they started playing to the Cambridge rules in 1861 and didn't play an organised match against another team until 1862. They are not, as Westby suggests, the third oldest club in the world. We could argue that the Hillsborough Barracks team at the time was just as organised and so needs similar credit. But we're not going to do that, as we have no record they too had a formally organised history. Forest do need some note, however, as one of their founders was Charles Elcock. He inspired the FA Cup in 1872. Forest were founding members of the FA in 1863, so did evolve some level of formal organisation by that point. Westby also states that Forest changed the name to Wanderers. Wanderers, of course, were famous for winning the very first FA Cup final. Again, this isn't exactly true. Wanderers was a team that splintered out from Forest in 1864. Both teams continued to play separately and even played each other at one point. This demonstrates the fluidity and semi-organised nature of football developing in London in the early 1860s. When Wanderers did become their own club in 1864, they did play at some interesting grounds like the Kensington Oval and Vincent Square, which is connected to Westminster School, right in the very heart of the city of Westminster, of course. Westby mentions in 1859 Mincing Lane FC. Again, there was no Mincing Lane FC. There was a Mincing Lane Athletic Club formed of city businessmen, but in 1863, not in 1859. I'm not sure where Westby got his sources from, but the year 1859 is simply wrong. Mincing Lane Cricket Club did play a form of football in 1863, but privately amongst its own members, and they did not play a match against another team until 1867, when the club had then become the London Athletic Club. Finally, Crusaders FC. Westby again says Crusaders formed as a club in 1859, but again, I'm sorry, but not the case, and another misuse of the label football club, I'm afraid. Once again, Crusaders were not a football club as we know it. Yes, they were, as you guessed it, a collection of ex-public school boys who did meet up to play as a private group. We don't know exactly where. They played ball games and we don't know to exactly what rules, and they did all this, we think, at some point during 1859. Whatever happened, the problem again is this wasn't an organised club, and you have no chance of joining this group if you didn't know the right sort from either elitist Westminster or Eton schools. It was like the other groups, closed and elitist, and not the model we have based our common idea of what a football club is and should be for this period. One thing we do know about Crusaders is they didn't actually play an actual match against another team until 1863. They were again later more organised and, like Forest, became founding members of the FA in 1863. But 4 years earlier, no, they certainly weren't a club as we have come to define an association football club. Do you see a pattern? Unorganised knockabouts by random collections of ex-public school members, later forming more organised events and matches around 1862 and 1863, then forming the English FA in 1863. I guess this was an emerging football culture, but it wasn't in the late 1850s and early 1860s as organised as what was happening in Sheffield, and what had started to happen at least a year or two before in Sheffield. We know the influence and spark for more structure and uniformity came from Sheffield, which is why the London FA, when it formed, used both the Cambridge and the Sheffield rules to form its own code in 1863. We need to remember that the formers of these early London teams had a different tool set to draw upon. Their experience of how to establish a sporting outfit and who it should benefit was very different from those who formed the Sheffield clubs. The London clubs started to realise by 1863 that association football had to become more organised in order to move the game forward, especially in their area. This is why they established the London-based FA in, of course, 1863. Sheffield association football was thriving and already developing very nicely even without an overseeing FA in the early 1860s. What we have today in terms of association football owes little to those early, more makeshift teams from London. What we have today has its roots in a more formal, organised template given to us by Sheffield FC, Creswick, Prest and later Yoden. Viewing videos 2 and 5 in this series will help you to see what I mean in more detail. I do realise I'm going on a bit, and you might say, why do I think all this is important? Does it matter whether the football club that is now organised or was organised at some point claims an earlier date for its formation? History and getting it right is important. Without understanding what we are trying to define or actually understand what it is we are trying to get to the roots of, to find out the actual history of what we have defined, without doing this we end up walking blind and coming up with nonsense like football started in China, or the Aztecs invented it, or some villagers created its idea back in the year whatever. We may even fall into the trap of thinking organised association football came out of universities and public schools and into the hands of the English FA, who then gifted it to the rest of the world by reluctant professionalism and careful growth of the early game. A common but untrue myth. If you care about the history of association football, then there are a few things you need to understand first. Firstly, what is association football and what makes up its constituent parts? I've tried to cover the first question in earlier videos, but football clubs definitely are one of its most important constituent parts. In my second video, I go as far as to say that association football would not be the experience it is today without the formation of one club in particular, Sheffield FC. The club template it created for other association clubs is the original association football club template. This is my understanding of most things. Unless we can all agree what it is we are defining and trying to understand, if we can't agree that, then we'll all get different answers. If we can't agree, then we do end up getting nonsense, the nonsense that we see all over social media, and even actually in some official circles for that matter. Unfortunately, too many football historians fall too easily for the common mistake of not remembering what an association football club actually is by definition. There seem to be a lot of clubs out there who claim they are older than they actually are because they heard reports of people in the local area kicking a ball about on a local piece of ground, etc. But that isn't the origins of their football club. If a bunch of mates kicking a ball around between them constitutes the formation of a football club, then I created a football club in my youth many times over. We could say that the cricket club members in Sheffield playing kickabout football in 1855 at Bramwell Lane was the start of Sheffield FC by that bar, but we're not going to. There were also reports of Hallam members playing kickabout games before they formed in 1860, but they were not a formed organised club at that stage. I'm sorry to have to say this, but we do seem to have acquired an historical different bar when deciding if collections of old public schoolboy networks, mainly in London, were actually clubs, compared to, say, northern cricketers or soldiers meeting regularly to play a game with a ball. I'm not sure why. Okay, in summary to all that, please don't give the label of association football club to any group that clearly isn't an organised association football club. Stop doing it. Anyway, I'll stop there as I think I've made my point. I'm interested to know what people think of that view. Please leave comments. Okay, so we've arrived at our final club, All Saints Night School FC, and the big reveal as to where the ground was, Hull Car Lane. All Saints School opened in 1871 on Ellesmere Road. We walked past the location just earlier. At some point in 1871, the night school members of the school formed a football club. I know I've just been going on about football clubs from schools, but this one was different because this was the very first state school football club in the world. Just another of Sheffield's many association footballing world firsts. Hull Car Lane does go further up the hill, but this is the most logical location for the ground next to the railway, since further up the hill does get quite steep. At some point in the late 1800s, this area changed dramatically and the very large Atlas Steelworks was built over the ground site. The name Hull Car Lane also changed to Carwood Road. Before we finish, let's just recap where those three important early Sheffield grounds all were. We started off back in Parkwood Springs, and here was the Parkwood Springs ground, the old recreation ground. We then walked over to Pitsmoor and Burngreave and we found the Fox Street ground, now the Nottingham Cliff Recreation Ground. And we've ended up here on Carwood Road, which used to be Hull Car Lane. I hope you've enjoyed this mixture of debate and historical ground hunting, looking into the history of 4 early Sheffield clubs and the 3 grounds that they played at. Please like, subscribe and leave a helpful comment if you've got one. Next time I want to make a video purely about some of Sheffield's early lost football grounds. Till next time.